Right, members. Let's invite the administration and the deputations in.
Không phải咁清靜啊！
撞咗好多，知道今日係咁。
乜都撞。歡迎政府官員。
So I would like to welcome the administration's team. So let's wait for the deputations to come in. On behalf of the Bills Committee, I would like to welcome the deputations to the meeting of the Bills Committee on Clearing and Settlement Systems Amendment Bill 2015. And I also wish to welcome our officials. For those who require interpretation service, please wear the earpiece and choose the channel that you prefer. And we have a total of 8 deputations today. And we've received 8 written submissions in total. The submissions have been issued to members. And the administration will be invited to give a written response. 3 organizations, including the Banking Association, will give written submissions later. So I'll invite the deputations to speak, and then the administration can respond, and then members can ask the administration or deputations questions. The usual practice here is that submissions from the deputations will be uploaded onto the LegCo's website unless deputations request that their submissions be kept confidential. And please do give us your written submissions. And I want to remind deputations that your written submissions and your verbal submissions will not be covered by the LegCo Powers and Privileges Ordinance. Right, so the first deputation, Mr. Joe Locke, Internet Professional Association. Good afternoon. I'm Joe Locke. I represent the Internet Professional Association. 3 years ago, we gave our views to the HKMA on payment systems. Concerning mobile payment systems, it was a new concept 3 years ago. 3 years ago, we said that there should be a new platform for SMEs, including smaller IT companies, smaller retail outlets. At that time, we spoke to the HKMA, and the policy or the rationale behind the policy is to maintain financial stability and integrity. I understand that financial stability and integrity are very important for Hong Kong, but then with we think that IT and innovation are also very important aspects. And so concerning SMEs, young people, people, market players. We hope that they can all play a part, and we must look ahead. Without the INT Bureau, we can only lay down conditions or eligibility criteria for being licensees, those who have experience in relevant fields, and those who haven't committed acts of misconduct. So 3 years have lapsed. 3 years ago, mobile payment systems was something new. But now all the market players have become giants. And SMEs will only be able to take part in the next wave of internet financial development and financial innovation. We hope that you can require these giants to exercise their corporate social responsibility. There should be a fair and open platform that can be used by SMEs, and we hope that these giants can hire more young people so that young people can have brighter prospects. Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, we have Mr. Chen from the Association of Cloud and Mobile Computing Professionals. Yes, Chairman, I set up the association last year. Before that, I worked in the banking sector for over 2 decades. I, in fact, teach part-time in the mainland. I teach postgraduate courses in the mainland. And in the past 2 or 3 years, my experience in the mainland has made me feel worried about the situation in Hong Kong. So I try to identify inadequacies in Hong Kong and how the inadequacies can be addressed. I want to point out one inadequacy first, and that is I haven't received any papers from LegCo concerning today's meeting. Now we don't have a fax machine in the association. If you go to the mainland, if you go to Shenzhen, you can see that there are no parking meters. In Shenzhen, you only need to park the car in a parking space, and there is a sensor there that can sense the vehicle. So people either use an apps or they use WeChat. They just press 2 keys and everything is done. But in Hong Kong, we haven't really moved ahead. We haven't moved forward. There are a lot of inadequacies in our present legislation concerning mobile applications and also payment systems. They did not exist a few years ago. So from the point of view of a financial practitioner, I fully support this bill. Without the legislation, will be lagging behind other places and other countries. There are a few areas we need to work on. Firstly, our traditional banking laws in Hong Kong do not require that account holders know where money deposited in their accounts comes from. You only know that some money has gone into your account. And that's an obstacle to the development of mobile payment systems. And there is no interface between the old operating systems and the new operating systems in banks, and as a result, some bigger players can have transactions with banks, and that will affect the development of the smaller companies for PayPal, Google. In fact, these companies started off with only a few people, and their development depended on an open platform. In the UK, there is the ODI, and the financial sector has to comply. But in Hong Kong, we, as far as I know, we haven't got even studies in such directions. So I hope that members will understand that this bill can only meet the needs of the present. I think we need to have experts, professional leaders who can spearhead far-sighted legislation that can benefit Hong Kong. We need such legislation so that Hong Kong can become a center for internet transactions. At the moment, we don't have such conditions. The banks are not ready, and we do not see such a vision in this bill before us. Thank you. Mr. Lee Wai-cheng. Yes, thank you. The UnionPay chairman has been looking forward to such legislation. A year or two ago, we started communicating with the HKMA. Now we have business in over 100 places or countries around the world, and we can see that in those places, there have been innovative payment systems, and there are many different types of payment products. Some of these products are being applied in Hong Kong. For example, cross-boundary payment services. These have been introduced to Hong Kong. But then we need proper legislation, or there will be clearing problems. For example, in respect of taxation, it's difficult to monitor. We need to have the legislation to monitor the development of cross-border payment products in Hong Kong. And we also hope to stimulate development in payment systems in Hong Kong. We hope that players can make use of local and overseas innovative products. We hope that they can also develop products that can suit the local situation. We can see that, in fact, many of these facilities have been developing rapidly in Hong Kong. For example, there are some additional functions to bank cards, and there are some facilities which absorb funds from the public directly for payment purposes. We really need more rigorous monitoring, and the legislative amendments are apt, but we hope that after the bill is passed, there will be clearer and more specific guidelines.
For instance, the bill says that the HKMA has the right to revoke or suspend the license of an operator or facilitator. Now, what I would like to mention is whether it's account in the name or otherwise of the holder, and if the account is being used, and when the license is licensed, you cannot immediately stop the account holder from using the account. Now, the account holder or card holder has already consumed. But if the operator has ceased operation, then if it is a card issued by one of the brands, we would have to meet the clearing needs. So we think that the guidelines have to be clear. When a license is revoked or suspended, how do you ensure that the account holder who has made a purchase can still effect the clearance by us? This is the consumer protection of the float that's mentioned in the bill.
Generally, PayPal is in support of the introduction of the licensing regime for stored value facilities, and we've reviewed the bill, and overall we're very, very happy. We've participated in the industry consultation and public consultation and sought to influence the drafting of the regulation, and we've noticed that, as promised, that there are some sections in there that are quite favourable to PayPal. Thank you for that. The only thing I'd like to just highlight is that the regulation shouldn't be so broad as to unintentionally regulate certain entities that it had no intention of regulating. And what I mean by that is when I look at the definition of facilitator, I wonder who it's trying to regulate, because I notice that they need to be licensed as well. And it could be so broad as to include payment gateway partners that work with PayPal. So I ask that we get some clarification on the definition of facilitating and what constitutes a facilitator. Yes. And one more thing I'd like to add is that the monetary authority has the ability to attach conditions, and we are given 14 days to argue that the grounds on which they decide to attach the conditions. But I'd like to highlight that just as in the event of revocation, that the licensees have the right to refer the decision to a tribunal, we would like to have the same opportunity to refer the decision prior to the monetary authority attaching any conditions when we seek an application. For example, I know that the monetary authority has the power to set a maximum value on the stored value. Unfortunately for PayPal, we don't have such things. Or it could require us to comply with certain AML requirements that we can't comply with in 1 month. So it requires product build. It requires a lot of work in the background. So we'd like to be able to refer the decision that the monetary authority makes and appeal if at all possible. That's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. 下一位陳日文先生係德勤關網陳。
Next, Mr. Chan Yatman of Deloitte, Touche, Tohmatsu. Now, these are not new proposals. We are already behind the mainland of China, and so we hope that through legislation and regulation, when the public uses these technological innovations to effect payments, they can be more confidential so that the market can develop more healthily. Now, apart from that, I hold similar views as an earlier speaker. Apart from legislation, there should be more guidelines made available For instance, the HKMA should issue more guidelines on the like the SPM Supervisory Policy Manual to set out more detailed requirements. For instance, as mentioned in the document, risk control procedures, AML matters, cyber risk matters, and detailed risk management. How is it to be effected? Now, previously, it's the banks that's regulated. So on risk management supervision, that's more mature. But we are now talking about non-banks. Some companies may be very active. If there are more best practice guidelines, these would help these companies to set up more mature risk management mechanisms. And in their future operations, they can do better in terms of internal control. Thank you. Next, Ms. Anna Yip, MasterCard International. Thank you, Chairman. Now, I represent MasterCard. We are an international payments company. We are in Hong Kong for the 27th year. We agree very much that with the vision for this mode of regulation in order to achieve a highly efficient payment system. Now, there are two papers, one about stored value facilities, SVF. We support this paper. Now, the spirit is that there are many prepaid cards or stored value facilities in the market, and in order to provide safeguards and assurance to the consumer, there should be regulations so that those who purchase the cards and make use of the facilities can feel more assured. And secondly, there's the retail payment system, the RPS. We understand that the HKMA needs to launch this, and we support that. However, now there should be a balance between regulation and free market. Now we are open city. We attract many people to come and start new businesses, and organizations like us bring new services to the consumers and companies. And hopefully with the new payment system, the regulation can be at a high level and be in a more macro mode rather than be very detail-oriented. Now, because that might affect innovation, the momentum and the speed of innovation. Next, Dr. Witman HUNG. Now, it seems that most people are supportive, but they have a but. Now, in May 2013, there was this consultation in which I participated. Now, I was a member of the industry, and now I'm a member of the public. Now, the bill has come out now. Now, I know legislation takes a long time, so when you legislate, you must be forward-looking, and you must be able to change. You must also look forward to how you might react to future changes. Now, this bill seems to be still based on what we know now. Now, the SVF has been in Hong Kong many years, so I think the bill is appropriate. Now, like PayPal or the WeChat payment, it's used for everything, but you can't do it in Hong Kong. Now, Tencent was $280 yuan, 280 yuan in 2013 when the consultation was done, but now it's much, much higher in value. It's very popular. The world changes very rapidly. If we think in traditional terms, we are lagging behind. Now, we might be proud of our position in the financial world, but we may be left behind in terms of innovation. No one can operate SVF unless they are licensed. Now this benefits the financial stability of Hong Kong, and the RPS for large-scale payments are now also included. Now, PayPal is registered in Singapore because they have relevant regulatory legislation. Now, if we have this kind of legislation, then we will be able to attract third-party retail payment systems like the PayPal to be registered in Hong Kong, either big or small. All along, we think Hong Kong has an opportunity. Now, I mentioned this to the FS and the CE. That is, we can be a clearance center for electronic service providers in the market. Now, so when many service providers go to China, they don't know what to do about renminbi clearance. Now, Hong Kong can fit such a role, but we need to change our attitude to embrace them rather than be at a loss as to in what way we are going to regulate them. Now, the mobile payments service providers, they've established their own banks. Now, so when that comes to be implemented or that comes to Hong Kong, then we need to be ready. Now, many small enterprises are at a disadvantage. So we need let them participate in the retail market on open data interchange. Now, this will enable Hong Kong to be more competitive. Now, how do we verify the identity of the users, etc.? We need to take a macro view. Now, we need to be a smart city. When we engage in financial reform, we need to consider other developments that are going on. I hope that the bill, once it's passed, will result in these factors being considered when the operations are implemented, so that more innovative companies can benefit. Octopus Cards Limited. Next, Mr. Sunny Cheung. Now, we think this bill seems to be targeting the Octopus cards because the other competitors are companies from outside Hong Kong. They are able to evade stringent supervision, and licensed banks, they already have the licenses and single purpose SVFs. We do not have to be regulated, so Octopus might be the only company that's regulated as a result of this bill. We are all proud of Octopus. People use it all the time. And this makes Hong Kong a very modern city compared to other jurisdictions. Octopus cards saves people money. Some people say it's cheaper to pay in cash, but that's not true. In the 17 years since Octopus cards has been established, we help the transport operators, large retailers, small outlets. They all use Octopus cards to reduce the cost in payments and receipts. Hong Kong becomes a more efficient society. We also provide more value-added service to the public so that the disabled, the elderly, and the students can benefit from the various preferential treatments. So
But then our mode of operation is still being challenged because of the low interest environment. Our income from interest has been going down, and then there are other factors which are pushing up our costs. Hong Kong people can make use of the Octopus service free of charge. They are used to this mode, and if the new legislation increases our costs, and as a result we have to transfer the extra cost to the consumers, that will not in fact work in our interest. It is true that the bill allows SVF operators to try to open up new sources of income, but then when we carry out these activities, do we need to have the prior approval of the HKMA? I understand that it's important that banks offer adequate protection for the savings of the consumers. And in fact, for the money stored with Octopus by customers, they are either put in banks or used to buy low-risk instruments, for example, instruments issued by the airport authority and so on and so forth. The new bill may err on the side of over-regulation. In fact, the legislation should only require operators to try to satisfy the requirements of the regulators. I understand that the bill seeks to cover all such services in Hong Kong, but then offshore operators can make use of advancing technology to circumvent regulation in Hong Kong, and as a result, Octopus may become the only SVF operator being regulated by the bill. And that's our concern. All right, so can I invite the government to give a response? Thank you. We're glad to have this opportunity to listen to the views of the deputations. I'm glad to hear that in general, deputations do support the bill. Deputations have also pointed out that the bill can help promote the development of financial innovation and technology, especially with regard to the development of SVFs and RPSs. Users and consumers' confidence can be boosted, and as a result, the usage rate can also be boosted. And with a clear, rigorous, regulatory regime, operators can make sound commercial decisions under the regulatory framework. And of course, we also have in mind the need to maintain the stability of our financial systems. Some have asked whether SMEs will be affected, whether there will still be room for survival and development for our SMEs. And some deputations have said that we should be more far-sighted concerning innovation and technology. I want to say that, in fact, the SAR government is fully committed to developing innovation and technology. And this bill only represents a small part of this overall strategy. In fact, in the budget, the Financial Secretary said a lot about how government would be promoting innovation and technology. The Financial Secretary has also announced that will be setting up a new platform on financial innovation and technology. In the process, we will definitely consult the trade or the industry, and that consultation will definitely exceed the scope of this bill before members. Back to this present bill. If the total amount of float is less than $1 million, then there can be an exemption or an exclusion. As to whether we can strike a balance between development and regulation, our intention is to lay down a clear framework in the law. And then for the details, the operational details, guidelines can be formulated by the HKMA. We understand that enacting legislation takes time, and so allowing the HKMA to formulate guidelines will be a much more flexible approach to help us progress with the times. And then concerning the definition of a facilitator, Mr. Lee from the HKMA can give a reply later. The facilitator has to have certain links with the issuer, and concerning the payment gateway and all these aspects, Mr. Lee can supplement. And then as to whether the industry can lodge petitions with regard to conditions imposed by the HKMA, for example, the cancellation of a license. Now, if now in the bill, if the HKMA makes certain decisions that will affect the issuer, then if I remember correctly, the issuer is usually given 14 days to give submissions. And of course, a decision can also be submitted to the tribunal for adjudication. And in the case of the proposed cancellation of a license, the licensee will be given the opportunity to seek an appeal before the decision is enforced. But then with regard to imposing of conditions, timing may be a very important factor. and we think it's appropriate to give 14 days or to give the licensee 14 days to give submissions. I think I've already provided some preliminary responses, and then now perhaps Mr. Lee from the HKMA can supplement. Mr. Lee, please. Thank you. Chairman, with regard to the facilitator, he facilitates the issue of store value facilities, and this is different from a payment gateway. A payment gateway is a way of payment by way of SVF or RPS. So a payment gateway will not be included in the definition of a facilitator. It will not be included under this definition. And then I've heard the view that the bill targets only a particular operator. I want to say that the proposed legislation is fair and it applies across the board. And with a clear regulatory framework, operators or potential operators will have to be brought under the regulatory regime. They have to obtain licenses, and there are requirements like capital requirements. So I want to say that the proposed regulatory framework is an objective one. Right, members, 5 minutes for each member. Mr. Chen Kam-Lam.
Thank you, Chairman. Now, I think regarding electronic development, development of electronic money in Hong Kong, I think I agree with some of the speakers that we are at the risk of lagging behind compared to other jurisdictions. Now, over the years, we have Octopus. Now, the market is not open enough yet after 10 odd years. And some of the speakers said that we have been too slow and have done too little, but Octopus thinks that we are targeting them. But my view is that as long as we have a good regulatory system for SVF, the market can be bigger and more open. Now, Octopus card is still very competitive. It's well-founded in Hong Kong. It has accumulated a lot of experience. So even if it faces new operators in the market, I think they are in a strong competitive position. So we do not need to worry that they become the victim in the new legislation as the target of the regulation. I think the bill will help the market develop more healthily. But I'd like to ask the deputations today, they offered a lot of valuable views. Now, in this bill, what do you think are the inadequacies? Where is there room for improvement so that there is greater scope for the development of the market in the future? So that regulation is not excessive, but provides more freedom for growth of the market, especially when we try to attract players from outside. Mr. Hong? I already mentioned open data interchange. When we start to regulate outsiders, people from outside Hong Kong, we should have principles that are fair and open. Now, the licensed banks already licensed. The Octopus cards are in a strong position. Now, for SMEs, especially run by young people, we talk about payment by mobile phones. We might have payment by eyeglasses. So how can we let them be in a position to interface with the banks or operate alongside banks? Our payment system is very expensive as regarding internet payment, and compared with other countries. Now the SMEs rely on an open market, so this bill will help the open data to be achieved. Now, hopefully there can be open data with regard to the banking system as long as data privacy is not infringed. Can you respond, administration, to open data matter? Now, actually, our bill is mainly about stored value facility, and some of the matters are not that speakers mentioned are not covered. Now, there can be more convenient payment, and this development of open data is a very major topic in the development of science and technology. This bill may not be the tool to resolve this matter. When we talk about the development of financial technology at a later date, this might be a very meaningful topic to follow up. And we will certainly look into how best to improve. Now, some deputations mentioned financial innovation, as mentioned by the FS, who has set up a group to study it, and the HKMA, Mr. Lee, you also might consider these views. Now, if payment gateways are very costly, then you might not be helping those who try to innovate. Mr. Sin Chung Kai, there is a joint representation on our table. Now, there are certain things not covered in the bill. As the Deputy Secretary said, these are not within the scope of the bill. But as Dr. Hong said, maybe the open data interchange can be facilitated as long as data privacy is not infringed. Now, the banks have their own retail payment system for their customers. Now, you talk about open data interchange. So the banks only deal directly with their customers. So I hope you can explain how can the bill be amended so that your proposal can be effective. And also I'd like to ask MasterCard. I believe it's Ms. Anna Yip. Now, I have your written representation. The last two sentences say, let me quote,
The RPS designation scheme should focus primarily on integrity and soundness of the system and avoid issues that could be dealt with appropriately through competitive mechanisms. 嗱，其實你可即係我唔知係咪你欲言又止啊
Do you mean to say that some provisions in this bill are in fact trying to regulate excessively? Now, well, maybe you are not being too clear in order to be diplomatic, but perhaps you can shed more light. The first question, from the deputations, Mr. Chen. Now, talking about transport legislation. Now, maybe you can use banking legislation for comparison. So I'll be direct. Now, the current situation is that we, as account holders, now there is competition, but you can ask the banks, they will not provide the transaction records to the account holder. They will provide data in their own format. Now, if you compare with Europe, they have Microsoft Money, etc., 10 or 20 years ago. Now, for the electronic products, as long as you get a code from the bank, all the contents of your transactions are then available on your own computer. In those days, all the providers like Microsoft, they have arrangement with the banks. Now, if you have different companies, you have different data format. Now, but in this day, now this kind of operation is out of date. Now, if you look at the UK, they have clear guidelines on this. If you if there are data transmitted with regard to these accounts with the banks, now you have to be providing data in a certain Excel format. Now, this interchange format is not available in our operations in Hong Kong. Now, the point is that we don't have them yet. Now, unless we have these elements, each bank will use its own influence, especially in the case of the larger banks. They will use some very strange format so that the external, so that the new entrants into the market will find it a barrier. Now, is there any data on the use of legislation in this regard? Now, the three associations sent in this joint letter, and it's just only arrived on the table, so we need to look at the data more closely. On the format requirements, maybe my colleagues can supplement, but Mr. Sin Chung Kai did say that there can be various ways whereby we can promote technological development, and we also need to look at what can be done and what would be the requirements for personal data interchange, whether there can be interchange of data on a platform open to all concerned, and what would be the conditions for taking part in the platform. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, so I may not be able to provide the answer right now. We will go back and look at it. And this topic, I believe, is not within the scope of the bill, it doesn't mean that it's not going to be implemented in the future. We should try to facilitate the flow of data. So in the exchange of interchange of personal data, we certainly need to do more work. Mr. Lee of HKMA. Now, in the past decade or so in Hong Kong, the major banks have provided internet banking, and these don't just target the individuals, but also the companies, large ones as well as SMEs. They help them to keep records and effect payments, etc. Now, of course, each bank has its own data format, so there is competition now. So they do try to meet the business needs of companies of all sizes. So we will study what is not yet covered. Perhaps you can provide us with information on guidelines by the more advanced countries in this regard. I do agree that it may not be achievable by legislation, but we hope something can be done. The second question by Mr. Sin is addressed to Ms. Yip. Okay, let me explain what's the basic message in our last paragraph. Now, we agree that the HKMA, we agree that there should be a highly effective and safe payment system in Hong Kong, and we like to highlight the point that despite the regulation, there can be support for innovation, because innovation is what Hong Kong has relied on. Now, what do the last two paragraphs mean? Now, MasterCard is in over 200 countries in the world. We process billions and billions of transactions a year. So we have accumulated a lot of experience in a lot of countries and jurisdictions, and the monetary authorities work with us in this regard. So we hope that the Hong Kong Monetary Authority can also establish a very good system so that we are provided with best practice guidelines. We would welcome that, but we hope it wouldn't be so specific as to require that when we provide new products or task schemes, whether it's on mobile device or internet, we all want to provide something that's safe and providing better customer experience.
So when we launch new products, we hope that we'll not need to obtain approval every time, because that may delay the launching of new products. But then we welcome an overall framework and also best practices. I hope that Mr. Sin now understands better what we're trying to say. Mr. Charles Mock. I've heard the deputations raise technical issues concerning open data interchange. It seems that the government has confused open data and open data interchange. Open data is about allowing the public access to data, and I hope that the government understands what is meant by open data and open data interchange. Mr. Chan gave the example of bank accounts, and in fact here we're not really talking about bank accounts. But for payment and settlement systems, now I have to mention names like MasterCard or Octopus, PayPal, UnionPay. Is it that they need to have standards so that I, as a consumer, I may have accounts with all these companies, and can I transfer the money from one account to another, and can I manage my money in these accounts together at the same time? So maybe each company can have its own API. Yesterday we saw some young people and so with certain standards, with these respective APIs, then there can be transactions which can benefit the consumers. So, Mr. Chan, was that what you were trying to say? And then I want to ask the government and HKMA this question. Will you be so doing things along this direction under the law, or using administrative means or other means? Mr. Chan. In fact, maybe I can clarify. For this new bill, it provides the regulatory framework for electronic transaction companies. And usually there should be interface with traditional companies. For example, Alipay. The money is not with Alipay. Alipay and PayPal have to respectively open accounts with banks. So they have their own banks behind them. And for this new system, it is this is not required for the new system to have interface with the old system, and so there will be confusion. Now I understand that in banks they have the SWIFT system. The SWIFT system handles big volume transactions. Several decades ago, banks joined together and they established the SWIFT system. So in Hong Kong, we hope to have the handset SWIFT format, or else there will be confusion. Can I now have a reply from the administration or from the HKMA? Mr. Lee. Concerning cross-system transfers, these are allowed under the bill. It depends on whether there is this demand in the market. Alipay, PayPal, MasterCard, if they operate SVFs in Hong Kong, then the law allows cross-system payment. In fact, we have looked at this possibility, and some operators, I believe, have considered whether there is a need for this function. In other economies, SVFs operate independently. They have links with banks, but then this present bill allows links with banks as well as links among different SVF operators. It really depends on whether there is the demand from consumers. I think members think there is such a demand, that there is such a need. But then would it be easier and cheaper to do it? Chairman, the law doesn't prohibit that, but my question is whether the government and HKMA will promote such development. The Financial Secretary says that Hong Kong should become the center for financial innovation and technology. So will the government and HKMA take up the role of promoting such development? I know that the law doesn't disallow such development. Chairman, I want to say that in the consultation exercise, we asked operators, and they said that at the present stage, the demand or the need was not that obvious or clear. Our position is that if there is this demand in the market, if operators think that there is a need to have this development, we are willing to try to promote such development. Mr. Chen Chi-chun. According to the government, the industry in general supports the legislation. They are of the view that with the legislation, with a regulatory regime, people will be more willing to come and operate the business. But then Mr. Zhang from Octopus sounds rather pessimistic. He has told us that Octopus may be the only company which will be regulated, while other operators can revamp their modes of operation to circumvent the government's regulation. I understand that Mr. Zhang is of the view that Octopus has been behaving very well, so is there a need to have the legislation? And people have a lot of confidence in Octopus. But in my view, I think all operators should be regulated. But and I want to ask the government this question: is it that other operators can really circumvent such regulation? Mr. Zhang sounds very pessimistic. He's of the view that other operators can change their modes of operation to circumvent the regulation. Is that really the case? What is the government's response? Mr. Zhang. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chen. We gave our views in the consultation exercise. We are in fact regulated under a special DTC license. We know how technology has developed, and the bill says that operators must be companies registered in Hong Kong. So what if there is a company registered in Hong Kong, but then all the money is not in Hong Kong, but in an overseas country? The member may think that I am very pessimistic, but I just want to say this from my company's perspective. would it be that the requirements will only apply to us, and for other operators, if their money is outside Hong Kong, then is it that the government can only give them advice? So I want to say that I'm not against the legislation. I just want to point out that we have to be very clear about the details in the bill, especially with regard to the scenario I've just mentioned. And then and also the monitoring of the money of the customers. Is it that it has to be zero risk, risk-free? So that's my worry. The government, please. Chairman. We attach importance to the views of all stakeholders. But I have to say that the legislation will apply to all operators across the board in the same manner. Mr. Zhang has told us that the Octopus company is now regulated under the banking ordinance, and in future it will be regulated under the clearing and settlement systems ordinance. And I think that will better reflect the nature of your business, and new opportunities may arise. Now, banks already have licenses, but for all operators, we impose the same requirement concerning how the float should be handled. Even for banks, we require that the float be maintained separately. So there will be the same level of enforcement taken for all operators. We need to provide for 100% protection in respect of the float. This is because we need to maintain financial stability, and also the users have money put or kept by the operators or the issuers, and we need to have protection, say by the banks or in the form of trust. Perhaps Mr. Lee from the HKMA can supplement here. Yes, Chairman. So we will enforce the law fairly. And for the float, we require almost zero risk because there is a need to protect the users. And there are a few formats that can be considered: trust, bank guarantee, or insurance. They can provide almost 100% protection for the float. Then Mr. Zhang asked whether only Octopus would be regulated in the future. I can boldly say that this is not going to be the case, because in the consultation process, some operators told us that with the passage of the bill, stored value facilities would be introduced by them in Hong Kong, so we'll not just regulate Octopus and not others.
With so many SVFs in this business, the monitoring framework applies equally to everyone, whether it's banks or non-banks who issue SVFs. We will treat them equally. Now, Mr. Chung asked if a company sets up a company and all the operations are overseas, might be on the Chinese mainland, then how will you regulate them? Now, actually, the document mentions this. Now, say there are some systems of that company that are operated overseas. Now, the HKMA may allow these systems to be operated outside Hong Kong, yet the HKMA will require that they have sufficient risk controls so that the systems are able to operate safely. Mr. Lee? Now, they are licensed in Hong Kong, so when we regulate, now we will do so whether some of the operations are abroad. We have on-site and off-site inspection. Even though some procedures are outside of Hong Kong, we will subject them to on-site inspection. We will send our colleagues to check how they operate. And most important of all, the floats must have sufficient safeguards to meet our regulation requirements. So we are not worried that they might have certain operations abroad. We will apply the same standard of regulation and monitoring. Now, Mr. Lee says that some of the procedures abroad will also be regulated. Now, so you're talking about Hong Kong registered company, but if a company has this system abroad and if they are targeting Hong Kong, their marketing strategy is towards Hong Kong people, will you monitor or regulate these companies? Now, if a company established an SVF company abroad and it carries out some promotions targeting Hong Kong customers, if we notice such a situation, we will notify the monetary or regulatory authority abroad in that jurisdiction and tell them that, and we will that the company is not licensed in Hong Kong. And we will publish in local newspapers notices to the same effect, that is, the company is not licensed in Hong Kong, so it's very difficult in that case for that company to grow its business in Hong Kong. Also, in the PowerPoint on page 2, it says that there's the exemption for banks, including fully licensed banks and I believe restricted licensed banks, and DTCs are included also. No, it's only fully licensed banks. They are deemed to be licensed. Now, they can engage in SVF business, but the regulating requirements are exactly the same as for banks. The float management to ensure security of the amount deposited, so it's the same as for banks. Now, you would have a lot of subsidiary legislation, right? Because licensing, the licensing provisions are very broad, it's a very broad framework now. Now, if you're going to have subsidiary legislation, now for the requirements of the subsidiary legislation, will you equate them to those of a registered DTC or trust company, or will you be more stringent? Because you say that only fully licensed banks will be deemed to be licensed. Now, Now, this is just a framework. At what level will be your regulation or supervision? Now, if it's not yet deemed to be a licensee, that is, if it's not a fully licensed bank, then the other operators will have to apply to be licensed. And the requirements for licensing are already made clear in the bill. So we don't expect that there will be any need for subsidiary legislation. Now, some speakers said that they hope the HKMA can issue guidelines for operations. I'm sure they will be issued. And I believe we do not need subsidiary legislation besides. So that means, apart from the fully licensed banks who do not have to apply for licenses, all the other operators have to be licensed in respect of SVF. Now, the SVF licensing regime and the SFO clearing system, there's similarities. We're talking about pure cash. Now, these are very technical matters which should be left to a Bills Committee meeting, because we have the deputations with us here today. Sin Chung Kai, I'd like to ask our guests. Now, in the last paragraph of the document, it says that legislation has to be forward-looking. And the representation says that the document doesn't include open data interchange. Now, apart from open data interchange, are there aspects of the proposed legislation that are not forward-looking enough? Now, your document mentioned share prices. It's a pity that we haven't bought those shares, but I am not very clear. Can you be more specific? What's left out of this proposed legislation? Something that's too stringent or too lax, maybe? Which of you three will reply? Mr. Hong? Mr. Witman Hung? Okay. Now, I'm not from the legal sector and I'm not from the accountancy sector, so I'm not an expert on legislation. On what's forward-looking, now what you see today is the current technology that uses RFID, etc., as a device to identify in payments. Now, I didn't mention the identity issue. The Octopus cards that has to be in the name of the person. Now, on mobile phones, you can use the mobile phone for authentication, and then the payment can be affected at the bank account. Now, are these things covered? Are there things that are even more new? Will you have to do more consultation and legislate yet again? Now, I'm not a LegCo member. I'm not a member of the administration. Now, I'm just asking, as someone from the trade, when these new things come up, will you have to legislate anew, the administration? Now, I believe the general considerations for legislation have public interest in mind. So if a market develops on its own and the system of the safety of the system is not affected, why don't we let the market develop freely? Now, I believe that's a concept in the background. Now, the bill, what this bill reflects is that the system has developed to a certain stage, and we see that there is need for clear legislation to effect regulation. Otherwise, there might be potentially serious consequences. That is why we think we need to legislate. Now, of course, I'm glad to hear the trade say that if there is clear legal framework, it will be helpful to the development of the sector. Now, I can't say right now what are the conditions that what occurrences will require legislation, or what technological developments will require a response by legislation or can be responded to by other means. We will be glad to follow up, however, and to listen to your views. Mr. Sin Chung Kai, our view is that we are afraid there might be some outcomes from legislation that will be in the way of technological development. Now, sometimes it's a matter of the market and not a matter with the technology. Now, in other jurisdictions, they might do very well. No, so it's not legislation posing a barrier. Now, one of the objectives of the bill, I believe, is to enable the new payment systems to be established in Hong Kong with sufficient safeguard from this legislation. So there are things in existing legislation that are in the way of technological development in Hong Kong. Now, so of course we need to take into account security, financial security. Now, so there are certain things that can be done abroad but cannot be done in Hong Kong because there are provisions in existing legislation that stand in the way. I think we need to take time to scrutinize the bill. So if you have good ideas, please continue to make representations in writing to this Bills Committee. Mr. Charles Mock, I'd like to follow up. I believe it's Mr. Lee who... I know Mr. Lee was responding to the question on the open data interchange, on whether it's standard. Now, Mr. Lee seems to have said that the HKMA has asked the trade and they do not clearly feel the need or are not in strong support. Now, perhaps these are the competitors, so they do not want to have full interface. The big players do not decide them, even though the small players would like to have this open interchange. So I hope the deputations can offer some comments. Otherwise, we have to hear from the government. Under what conditions would you have to intervene, or Otherwise, you would let the market operate by itself. Now, you say that the bill doesn't prohibit anyone from doing it. Now, have you considered whether it's possible that in future you might have to deal with this through legislation? Now, what I would like to find out is whether this matter has to do with legislation. Now, if we are told that these matters cannot be dealt with by legislation, then we can raise the case and try to take things forward by other means. So I hope the administration can respond. When do you decide? How do you decide when to intervene? And is there a certain stage where you think you need to intervene by legislation? The Deputy Secretary. Now, Mr. Lee was very clear just now. The legislation doesn't prohibit such a platform from coming into being. So this doesn't have to be. So in legislation, we do not have to spell out a method of resolution. Now, if people think that this needs to be taken forward, the government can also consider discussing with the stakeholders to see whether there can be cooperation to facilitate the development. And we will do that. Well, do we need to legislate to solve everything? That may not be the best way. Right now, it doesn't seem that there's such a need, because the bill doesn't stand in the way of the development of such an data interchange platform. It depends on whether there is need in the market. Then if there is need, then some service provider will certainly respond, and we will be glad to be the middleman, and we can all sit down and discuss. I believe we have been discussing a guideline, and perhaps when things are sorted out, the HKMA can issue a guideline. Mr. Kenneth Leung Kai-Chiu. Now, on SFO, now we can compare. Now, the industry might worry that the legislation is so restrictive that it stands in the way of advanced technology. And now there are two matters. One is the settlement system. Now, that legislation has been in existence for about 10 years. Now, they need to consider technology matters. Now, the government maybe can do it. Now, if in the settlement of securities, now how do you think? What do you think are the differences to make you worry that the scientific, the technological development is not being kept up with?
All right. Yes, Mr. Locke. I think this is a high-level issue concerning mobile payment. You see, at the moment, the players are all giants, including Octopus. SMEs and other market participants need to comply with their rules and regulations. I really hope that we can have more opportunities for our young people designing mobile apps. Do you know, for these stakeholders, $25 million is only a small sum. No, these are all very big companies. And innovation, in their view, is different from innovation in our view. We hope that they can hire more people. We hope that things can really happen in Hong Kong. We want to promote development of innovation and technology in Hong Kong. We hope that the people, the applications will not all be outside Hong Kong. So technology, the people, innovation and technology. We hope that there can be a platform I just hope that there will be more opportunities for smaller companies. In fact, when you consult, you mainly approach the bigger companies. The bigger companies may not want too much innovation that will affect their market status. We hope that the government can carry out studies to so that we can have another wave of innovation. We can't benefit from this wave, and we hope that in the next wave there can be a level playing field. There can be a platform for us all to start on an equal footing. Yes, Chairman. Concerning talents, the bill requires that certain procedures must be in Hong Kong for those who wish to operate here. And of course, there can be an exclusion if the float size is less than $1 million. We, in fact, in our bureau and also in the entire government, attach great importance to R&D and also innovation and technology. In fact, in the budget, you can see that the government is going to invest a lot of resources in promoting R&D and also innovation and technology. And there will be a task force on financial innovation. We think Hong Kong has the right conditions to develop technology, and we in our bureau, of course, attach great importance to the development of financial innovation and technology. We are in fact most willing to listen to views of stakeholders. We hope that we can have a critical mass of SVF operators and RPS operators in Hong Kong so that we can become a hub. Mr. Locke said that in the consultation exercise, the HKMA merely approached the big companies. I beg to differ. I don't think this is the case. In fact, before the consultation document was issued, Mr. Lee had approached suppliers, internet service providers, and many others. So I want to assure you that we will continue to listen to the views of all stakeholders. Yes, the task force on financial innovation should not only consult the big companies. For innovation and technology, you should also approach the smaller companies. You know, young people are full of new ideas, and I think it's useful to consult them. Mr. Sin Chung Kai. Chairman, in fact, during my meetings with the IT sector, the practitioners feel that sometimes the HKMA regulates excessively. Yes, I understand that we have to protect the customers, but concerning this bill, I want to know which parts of the bill may hinder the development of innovation and technology. Please tell us your specific suggestions. And we will proceed to clause-by-clause scrutiny of the bill very soon, and then the bill may be passed. Any immediate response, or will you also write in to us later? Dr. Hong. Yes, we can comment on the detailed provisions later. Hong Kong people and Hong Kong companies are law-abiding. In the mainland, they do it first, and even if there is no legislation. But then in Hong Kong, people wait for the legislation before they act. For example, third-party payment. Last time, Alipay came to Hong Kong to buy store value facility. Taiwan apologized and said that the act was not lawful, and then HKMA said the activity was not regulated, and so people had to take their own risk. So you can see the different regulatory approaches in different places. In Hong Kong, companies and people are law-abiding. So we have to have a wider and more accommodating regulatory regime. Mr. Charles Mock. I want to ask Mr. Zhang from the Octopus a question. You were worried that when the bill was passed, only Octopus would be brought under regulation. Now, I want to say that in fact, after the bill has been passed, operators will all need to obtain licenses, or the HKMA will be going after them.
The Octopus cards, they are regulated under the banking ordinance as a special case. Now, in the future, when you are under this bill, this new legislation, along with other payment gateways and settlement systems. Now, the public may feel that that would be more unified and more fair to everyone concerned. Now, because the others do it on the internet, and you might just do this on a card. Now, are you worried that there would be new approaches to what you have been doing in the future, that so that you are worried? We worry because we don't know whether overseas operators can simply have a simple office in Hong Kong and be able to do the business in here, and how do you regulate such activities? Now, whether our worry is established, of course, that depends on future enforcement. And on what can be done now but cannot be done in the future, there is none. Now, there is a lot of things that are covered in the new legislation, and we worry that do we need to get approval for everything, like new products and new charges, because innovation is by definition quite risky. So in the course of innovation, there may be a learning process. So we hope that when the new legislation comes into a being, there can be flexibility. Does everything have to meet the requirements of the HKMA, or is it that we can do new things under the existing framework? So will the new legislation be a step forward, or is it requiring us, going again to require us to do the same thing, that is get approval from HKMA for everything? Now, they are hopeful that the new legislation will allow more things to be done, but they are worried that everything has to be approved by HKMA. So perhaps we can let HKMA respond. Mr. Lee? Now, on new products, now the bill is mainly trying to achieve safety and security and efficiency. So we need to examine whether new products offer security, and that should not hinder innovation. But regulation is necessary. We have to ensure that the objectives of regulation are met. Now, regulation is different from approval. Do they have to get approval from you for everything new, or can they be assured that they can launch the new products first under the framework? Now, you worry that the customers' money should be safe. Now, if the money is safe, but if I offer a new product, for instance, an Octopus card that allows people to use the cross-harbor tunnels, so do you need to get approval? Yes, this is very important. This has to do with the legislation. Now, if it's not in the bill, can you make it clear? How do you deal with new products? Now, it's like in the telecommunications ordinance. There's a post facto approach, and as a post approach and an anti approach. Can we do it first and get approval later? Mr. Lee, it depends on in what way the product is new. For instance, you have been using the SVF for a certain cross-harbor tunnel and then you use it for a different tunnel, then that doesn't require approval. But if it's a business of an entirely different nature, then you must first get consent. Now, it's very simple. Now, we all know how to use Octopus card. Suppose Octopus card decide tomorrow to do some PayPal business. Does it have to apply to you for approval first? Mr. Lee? So this is a device-based SVF versus an internet SVF. So there's a substantial change from the original business engaged in. So they have to discuss with us first because there are some conditions attached. So the conditions might be different between those for a device-based versus a non-device-based SVF. So it depends on the nature of the new business. Is there a change in the nature of business? Chairman, now sometimes we don't just look at whether it's a device-based or non-device-based. Now, it's about risks and factors that are assessed in a more neutral way. So it goes back to what I was saying. Do I need to get approval from you first in every case? So people would be approaching you all the time for approval, or to use the to use the telecoms legislation. If it's merger acquisition, then they have to come to talk to you. Now, so what criteria will you have so that for simple things they don't have to come to you? You should be clear. Now, of course, it's very difficult to anticipate new developments, but you should offer clearer explanation than you offer now. Mr. Chung, when you have questions, you can put them in writing and send to us. Now you regulate Octopus card, and it's on the risk, and it's risk-based. Now there's a device, and it's very different from the case where there is no device. So it depends on the business model. It's the same. So you say, I have a $2 billion guarantee for Hong Kong. That should be enough. So it's not just physical versus virtual. Now the trade will monitor the progress, and we would welcome whatever views you have. Mr. Kenneth Leung. Now, the trade and the administration have spoken. Now, as a consumer, I worry about the new products. Now, financial products are something not so concrete. Now, if I put some money in my account and so my interests need to be safeguarded, so the trade and the regulators need to discuss. Now, it's important what safeguard is offered. Now, I am not an IT insider, so can you respond? Mr. Chung, anything to respond? None. Administration? Mr. Lee? I agree. Now, basically, our regulatory framework is risk-based. Basically, there are some minimum requirements in the conditions, and then we have some guidelines. Now, why is there a difference between internet-based and device-based ITF, SVF? Now, for anti-money laundering legislation, there are different requirements. Now, if, say, the company has a new product that's internet-based, there may be different requirements in the details. So I use that example. Under certain conditions, the guidelines will need to be changed. So that's clear then, Mr. Charles Moore. Now, some speakers talked about the SMEs, the smaller companies that engage in these payment systems. Now, I know that Mr. Lee had been going to some forums and listen to the views of some local companies, and they engage in payment systems, but there are not many that are in the SVFs because a lot have been exempted. So my feeling is that they are concerned how this legislation will affect them in the future. Now, I do not see here today some of these local companies, maybe they didn't know about this hearing, or maybe they decided that they will not need to get a license. They will be able to handle the issue. Perhaps I can ask the deputations here today, do you know of local companies who are of the SME nature and they engage in remote payment or SVFs and they have concerns? Do you know of about them?
And has the HKMA come across such cases? I just want to know whether there are companies that will be directly affected. Some SMEs may be indirectly affected in the sense that they may not need to obtain licenses, but their innovation services are related to these companies. Just want to know the direct impact on certain SMEs. And then for SMEs which have to be or which have to be licensed, which have to obtain licenses, how many of them are we talking about? Any idea, Ms. Yip? Let me talk about my company. Some companies wish to issue prepaid cards. I think the HKMA is aware of this. In Hong Kong, we are an open city, but then there is also regulation. And when payment is involved, of course, there are certain obligations and responsibilities, and then people do know that because the float is concerned, customers must be protected. And our company has rigorous ways to vet whether companies are eligible. So, say for payment companies that want to join hands with us, if they want to issue prepayment cards, we do vet their situation. For small companies, I mean for micro companies, they should not operate prepaid service. Only companies with the financial strength can operate prepay service. I think the HKMA's guideline is not a very big concern. But then concerning float management, what is the appropriate mode? And how can the actual management of the float satisfy the HKMA's requirements? Because in this bill, we're only talking about the framework. And so HKMA must issue suitable guidelines for the industry. Mr. Lee. Chairman, in the consultation process, we consulted all companies involved in such business. So we did consult very extensively. Because there are these very rigorous requirements, and then there is the anti-money laundering ordinance, and so smaller companies simply are not able to operate such business. You have to really hire a lot of people to ensure compliance. But then there are companies which make use of credit card service, but then they at the same time provide some service that convenience the consumers. You mean the store value is with them? A remote payment? No, not necessarily remote payment. Just want to know whether there will be a lot of impact on local SMEs, because it seems that they are not the ones that will have to obtain licenses when the bill is passed. Mr. Lee. Thank you, Chairman. Basically, there shouldn't be too much impact on such companies. In fact, there aren't many such small companies involved in the business. Mr. Locke. Yes, Mr. Locke? Yes, can you hear me? Retail payment systems because if the money is used at retailers have to incur a cost. You'll be regulating big companies. They set very high standards, and as a result, SMEs and small retailers will have to incur high cost if they want to interface with them. So I think there should be an environment conducive to the development of payment systems by small retailers, because there are these giants. The small companies have to follow them. I think in this bill, you should specify that the interfacing issue should not be a barrier for the entry of new payment systems. If you put it down, then there will be positive effects on the prospects of young people. The big companies tend to make their systems very difficult, very sophisticated. I think the core government should act as a referee in a football match. So government should plan ahead. There should be a platform which can enable ODI and also technology that may develop in the future. Mr. Sin Chung Kai. So we can see the difficulty. Now some say that in your regulatory regime you should only target the broad principles and not the details. And of course the broad principles are security, safety, and then you leave the details to the companies, and then the companies will work out measures to ensure safety and security. And then SMEs may say, because you demand such a level of security and safety, our development is hindered. And then people may ask the HKMA whether the regulation should be on the broad principles or the details. So should we ask the HKMA to regulate only on the overall or broad principles, or also on the details? They are not the Innovation and Technology Bureau, but then because of this technology, I think we really need an open platform. Now, yes, we may want to pursue development and innovation and technology, but then this should not be done at the expense of the interests of consumers. And of course, if anything goes wrong, people will blame the government and the HKMA for not regulating the activities. I am for innovation and technology, but then at the same time, there must also be adequate protection. The industry feels that you should not be regulating each and every product, each and every service. So the regulation should not be at a very detailed level. But then at the same time, we can't just say in the bill that we should balance development and security, for example. All right, so we thank the deputations for coming today. So if you have further views, you are welcome to write to us. Thank you very much.
OK， 咁我哋就你哋可以。
All right, the deputations can be excused. Thank you once again. We've got paper 656, 14, 15, bracket 10. So perhaps the administration can take us through that paper. Chairman, Mr. Liu can take members through the reply. Yes, Mr. Liu. Thank you. Chairman, at the first meeting of the Bills Committee, members asked certain questions. We issued the reply to members last week. First of all, at the last meeting, some members asked about how single purpose SVF should be handled. Now, I want to say that the Clearing and Settlement Systems Ordinance doesn't seek to regulate single-purpose SVFs. At the moment, single-purpose SVFs are prepaid coupons or vouchers issued by coffee shops, cake shops. We do not want to strangle the business of these retailers. And also, our primary concern is financial stability, and these single-purpose SVFs should not affect financial stability, and that's why we do not intend to regulate single-purpose SVFs. But then if a single-purpose SVF becomes a multi-purpose SVF, then the issuer will be brought under regulation. And then concerning issuers outside Hong Kong soliciting Hong Kong customers, I want to say that the bill targets SVFs issued in Hong Kong, and concerning what is meant by issuing and operating SVFs, we have explained clearly that issuing in fact includes operating. And so when the HKMA thus its enforcement action, it will look at a number of principles. First, the place where the issuance takes place, and then the denomination or the currencies accepted, and then the service, the nature of the service provided to the customers, and then whether the service is widely accepted in the retail sector, how value can be added, and also descriptions in the advertisements. So for SVFs, if Hong Kong people can have access to these SVFs and yet they are issued outside Hong Kong, then we need to consider all these factors to decide whether the SVFs are considered to be issued and operating in Hong Kong. And if the answer is yes, then the issuer will have to obtain a license from the HKMA. And then the third question, there are issuers who may operate their systems outside Hong Kong. But then we have to make sure that the licensee is a body corporate under Hong Kong laws. So, and as a result, we'll be able to get hold of someone in charge. Schedule 3 in the bill details the principles. The company has to put in place suitable risk management measures and procedures. The business plan must be sound and safe, and there must not be any disadvantageous effects on Hong Kong people. So to some operators, or for some operators, part of their operating systems may operate outside Hong Kong. But the HKMA can require the licensee to provide relevant information. The HKMA can issue guidelines, and the HKMA can also study the accounts, and they can also be field or non-field audits by HKMA.
This ensures that the HKMA can implement effective regulation. Mr. Charles Mock, you have a question? I will leave my question till later. Let Mr. Sin ask his question first. You can ask by each item. We are now on page 4 of the Chinese version. Now, a question was that when we come to the licensing, how do we determine the float? As I said, the bill is in respect of SVFs issued in Hong Kong. So when we calculate the relevant float, we are talking about the total float of the SVF license in Hong Kong, because we are not trying to target an offshore company or the mother company. Now, the fifth question has been touched upon by the deputations, some prepaid cards and debit cards. Now, if the prepaid card is issued in Hong Kong, then they will be regulated under this bill. As for the debit card, it's a retail payment system, so the HKMA will consider whether the RBS will affect the security of Hong Kong as a financial center. So not all systems will be regulated. It's only large-scale RPSs, if they are potentially threatening to financial stability in Hong Kong, only then will we designate them as the subject of regulation. Now, we are trying to strike the right balance, because if we regulate every single debit card, then it will deter some new entrants who do not have a major impact on the financial stability. So we do not authorize the HKMA to regulate these debit cards. I can give an example. For instance, some large-scale credit card schemes represented here just now, they are already of a large scale, and they issue a large number of cards in Hong Kong, and the transaction volume may be very large. For instance, MasterCard said that it's in the billions. So if they have a serious problem with their system, then it will have a major impact on the retail sector. Many customers may be using that debit card. So such organizations are likely to be designated by the HKMA. For instance, Hong Kong Bank, say, issues a MasterCard debit card. Now, MasterCard doesn't issue debit card by itself. It works with, say, the HSBC. Now, in that case, the bank's business is already regulated by the HKMA. So if the bank issues a debit card, it's already regulated under the existing framework. So say the HSBC issues a MasterCard debit card, does the MasterCard have to apply for under the regulatory regime? No. Now, for RPS, we regulate the operation of the system. We are not giving approval to the operator of the credit card to we're not requiring them to get a license from us when they issues a card. We are trying to regulate the operation of the entire operation of the credit card. And also members asked about some internet service providers. Now the bill says that if someone knowingly assists some unlicensed SVF to operate, then it would have infringed the law unless there is reasonable excuse. The bill makes clear that reasonable excuse is a defense. So now also some deputations just now and members also that a theme in the bill is to protect the consumer and shore up the financial security. So we issue guidelines to spell out details. So the float will be securely managed. The bill says that there should be sound risk management procedures to ensure that there is enough money to protect the integrity of the amount accruing to the customer, and the amount deposited by the customer has to be kept separately from the company's own funds. So there will always be enough funds to meet the customer's obligation. So all this is in Schedule 3, and the HKMA intends that after the bill is passed, there would be publicity and education, and there would be a list of the licensees on the web page of the HKMA to ensure that the licensees and also we ensure that the licensees have a mechanism to deal with the complaints. The document also has a detailed appendix for members to understand that the measures in respect of the SVF and RPS, the licensing system, etc., is similar to those in other jurisdictions, and we are able to glean from their experiences. Now, I will not go into the detail of each and every requirement, but for SVF, there's a licensing system in most jurisdictions. As for RPS, as explained, it's mostly dealt with by designation. Now, the regulatory approach for both SVF and RPS will enable the authorities to ensure that risk is controlled and the needs of the public are met. So we are not doing something new. We have been learning from other jurisdictions. so the public can be assured that as an international financial center, our approach is consistent with those abroad. And also, after the bill is passed, the HKMA will continue to maintain links with authorities abroad, and memoranda will be signed. Sin Chung Kai. Now, several years ago, concerning gambling legislation, there's some such requirement. It was said that if there's gambling on overseas websites and bets are placed through local banks, now that would constitute a crime, so the banks will not debit the amount in Hong Kong. Now, what does this have to do with what we're discussing now? Now, in the future, you might have some system that is licensed in Hong Kong. Some will not be licensed in Hong Kong, or they don't want to come to Hong Kong at all. But others have got a license. So when the amounts are debited from these accounts, will you notify the banks that the payments will not be affected? Now, right now, if there are overseas gambling practices which are infringing our gambling legislation, and if the local banks provide the service, we prohibit that. Now, because this infringes our gambling or anti-gambling legislation. Now, there will certainly be similar situation in the future, because now, if the Hong Kong account is debited for some payment system that is not licensed in Hong Kong. Now, I understand what you are saying about the gambling legislation, but if in future accounts are debited in respect for some payment system, say Octopus. Now, Octopus is licensed. Now, there is automatic transfer. Now, there might be in future some system that is not licensed in Hong Kong, and yet my account is debited for payment to that payment system. Will you request the banks not to effect the transfers? Mr. Lee? We will consider that. If it intentionally wants to evade our supervision, then as in the case of gambling legislation, we will adopt a similar approach. If it intends to get Hong Kong people bets, no. Now, let's make it clear. Now, many people have multi-currency accounts, so they may have links with service providers abroad, these account holders. Now, some of these services don't advertise in Hong Kong, but say I have a US dollar account, I let my account be debited to make payment for a payment system in the US, but that system is not licensed, US system is not licensed in Hong Kong. Now, that system is not in Chinese, they are not catering to Hong Kong people. In that case, will you advise the banks not to serve those overseas systems? Or is it as in paragraph 4, You say you will let the banks. Will you let or not let the bank serve them?
呢個問題我哋
We'll have to study this in detail. Because the business is not licensed in Hong Kong, it doesn't operate in Hong Kong, and it doesn't target Hong Kong customers. So is that equivalent to cross-boundary payment? We'll have to look at this. Yes, Mr. Charles Smock. Chairman, I want to refer to para 12 and 13 of the reply concerning the liability of ISPs, Internet Service Providers. Maybe the government didn't understand my question. In the reply, they merely say that there are certain liabilities, and then there is also a defense. We now know that in fact under different ordinances there are different treatments for ISPs. 8C bracket 3, it says including other ways, any other ways, so it's not specific. It's saying any other technological means, and that's really worrying. And there are different treatments for ISPs under different ordinances. Under the copyright ordinance, there is the safe harbor provision, no sanctions. But then here, there are sanctions. And there is another ordinance or another piece of legislation, and that is the COIA ordinance, and it says that a committee will have to be set up, and there is no need for legislation. So this is most stringent. So it is not that anyone will be liable, but rather some are singled out. So I want to know whether this is a new concept, or is it that this concept can be found in other ordinances? Because is it that the internet service providers are singled out? I think they rightly feel worried. Mr. Mark has mentioned a few approaches. In fact, this present approach is most lenient. How come? Because they will be punished or sanctioned. ISPs do not need to ascertain whether the client has obtained a license. Say if an ISP unknowingly provides service to an SVH operator, and this operator has not been licensed, that will not mean that the ISP has to be held responsible. But if the ISP knowingly aids or abets an unlicensed SVF to operate a business, then of course it will be punished. And then there is a provision concerning defense for the ISP. ISPs may be dealing with thousands of clients' websites. They cannot ask each and every one of them the details. And so we think this proposed approach is appropriate. And I think this approach represents the right balance. So after the HKMA has warned the ISP should stop the service, or else it will be knowingly providing the service to an unlicensed SVF operator. Right? Yes, correct. But then there are still many questions, Chairman. You may tell the ISP that it should remove the connection. It's a pity that we don't have technology-based companies here today. But you know, concerning cloud operation, we may have a company which is a global internet service provider, and it operates certain services in Hong Kong. It has a client in another country operating legally or illegally, and that has got nothing to do with Hong Kong. But the Hong Kong authorities may require the provider to remove the connection of this client. And then you may say we are only talking about Hong Kong servers, but then given the cloud technology, such definitions are really meaningless. So anyone should be enough, but you are specifying ISPs, and we're not talking about servers or web hosting. Say a company may have all its servers in another place. What is meant by not providing any connection? Because in Hong Kong we don't have a blocking list as to which websites can't be accessed. So ISPs, in fact, may not know that they will be affected, and that's why none of them are present today. I think that's a worry about this technical issue. And I also want to know whether there are other pieces of legislation singling out ISPs, specifically mentioning that they are covered, that they are regulated. Because you say here anyone, and then you say including those providing network or internet connections or other technological means. In fact, from a technical point of view, we think this provision is not clear because this provision is simply not enforceable given the present state of technological development. All right, so please consider Mr. Mok's point. Yes, Ms. Yan. Yes, we'll consider this point, but Mr. Mok mentioned connections outside Hong Kong. I don't want to be too specific. But then, as Mr. Liu has said, there are two tests. First, the ISP knowingly commits the offense. And then the second test is whether there is reasonable defense. And so there is this reasonable defense provision. Some people think that this approach would be clearer. During the consultation stage, we didn't receive any counter proposals or objections. But then when we'll of course discuss the details of members during clause by clause scrutiny. I want to say that the contexts in different ordinances are different, and so we may not be able to adopt the same approach under all scenarios. So I hope that the member will understand that we are proposing this approach for this unique context. We think this is a reasonable and also sympathetic approach. Sorry, Chairman, can you let me finish? But then time's up, Chairman. I think we can revisit this paper next time. I just want 1 minute. But I have other things to deal with. AOB. I have to deal with date of next AOB. We can continue next time. I just want to ask a question. Yes, now Octopus is worried that only Octopus needs to be licensed after the bill is passed. No, most of the money is with the banks. If the money can't go to the payment systems operating in Hong Kong, then these people can't do business. So I hope that you can consider whether this is really going to be the case. Now, we've got 2 slots, 4:30 on the 13th of April, and then 8:30 on the 28th of April. All right, the meeting is adjourned.